One of the most psychologically destabilizing experiences a narcissist can endure is the collapse of the narrative they've constructed about themselves and their place in your life. This isn't just a blow to their pride. It's a seismic fracture in their very identity structure. See, narcissists don't operate in reality as most people understand it. They live within a kind of psychological theater, one where they're always the central character, the one who matters most, the one around whom all others revolve. But that narrative is fragile. It only works if everyone else agrees to play their part. And for a time, you probably did. Perhaps not willingly, perhaps not consciously, but still, you played it. You explained, defended, tried to be understood. You rationalized their behavior, minimized your needs, or endured their unpredictable emotional climate in the hopes that something would finally shift. But over time, something more important shifted instead. You. You see, the narcissist narrative depends entirely on control. Emotional control, perceptual control, even control over the definition of truth in the relationship. They rewrite history when it suits them. They downplay your pain, amplify their wounds, and twist logic until it becomes a tool for dominance rather than dialogue. And all of it feeds one central aim: to maintain the illusion that they are irreplaceable, powerful, and always one step ahead. But the illusion only lasts as long as you agree to see it as truth. The moment you stop participating in that delusion, when you begin to see through the manipulations and respond not with anger, but with clarity and detachment, that's when it all begins to unravel. Not necessarily in a dramatic way. It may not be loud, but it's devastating, because in that moment, you're not just walking away physically, you're withdrawing psychological validation. And for someone who built their identity on external affirmation, your silence becomes existentially threatening. Now, this isn't just a personal betrayal in their eyes, it's a symbolic one. Your departure signals something they've worked hard to conceal even from themselves. That the story they've been telling about who they are and how others perceive them is fiction. That realization doesn't occur instantly. It creeps in, often masked by rage or indifference or another round of blame shifting. But beneath that surface defensiveness is the quiet terror that maybe, just maybe, they've been wrong about who they are all along. And it's here that we must touch on something that's psychologically complex: the relationship between identity and narrative. We are, in many ways, storied creatures. We make sense of ourselves through narrative. We know who we are by recalling what we've done, who we've loved, what we've endured. But when that story is rigid and constructed not on truth, but on fantasy, on grandiosity, on the illusion of control, then any crack in it can feel like a death. So what happens when you step out of the role they cast you in? They're left with an empty stage. They may scramble to fill it, projecting onto someone else, trying to recreate the same dynamic with a new target. But it never works quite the same, because you weren't just another actor in their story. You were the one who saw them deeply, perhaps more than anyone ever had. And when someone who truly saw them walks away, they're forced to reckon with something even more disturbing than abandonment: the idea that the story itself was never real to begin with. And what fills the space left behind isn't just loneliness. It's disorientation. They don't know who they are without the role they played in your life. Because your presence, paradoxically, gave their false self meaning. And now your absence reveals the emptiness that was there all along. This is the precise moment their grand narrative begins to collapse. Not just because you left, but because you left without needing them to understand why. You exited the stage, not with vengeance, but with dignity. And in doing so, you didn't just end the relationship, you ended the illusion. And that's what makes your silence so powerful. It speaks a truth their ego can't refute. And in that space, the story begins to crack, and the narcissist is left to face the one thing they fear above all else: the truth of who they are without you. Emotional detachment, it sounds deceptively simple, almost clinical. But in the realm of narcissistic dynamics, it's a profoundly subversive act, because emotional detachment isn't the absence of feeling. It's the mastery of it. It's what happens when you stop reacting, when your emotions are no longer leveraged, manipulated, or used against you. And when a narcissist sees that they no longer have access to your inner world, that's when they begin to lose control in the most meaningful way. Now, narcissists don't just want your attention. That would be too shallow an interpretation. They want something far more intimate. Your emotional engagement. Your highs, your lows, your frustration, your despair, your hope. Every reaction you offer serves as proof that they still matter to you. Even your anger, even your tears. These are signs to them that the cord hasn't been cut. You're still tethered. And if you're still tethered, they can still pull the strings. That's what makes your emotional detachment so threatening. It's not just that you've walked away, it's that you've walked away internally. You're no longer triggered. You're no longer seeking their validation. You're no longer bending yourself into emotional contortions to maintain the illusion of harmony. You've begun to respond rather than react. And in doing so, you've reclaimed something the narcissist was never entitled to in the first place. Your sovereignty. Now, let's be clear. This isn't about becoming cold or indifferent. That's not detachment, that's numbness. And numbness, while sometimes necessary in survival mode, still implies unresolved pain. True detachment is different. It's an act of psychological clarity. You see the narcissist for who they are, not who they pretended to be, and not who you hope they could become. You stop projecting your empathy onto them, and instead you begin to observe, not with judgment, not with bitterness, just with precision. And this, interestingly enough, is when the narcissist often makes their most desperate attempts to reel you back in. They might become more charming, more apologetic, more self-aware. They might suddenly remember your worth or pretend to, but it's not a genuine epiphany. It's a defense mechanism. What they're really reacting to is the loss of power, because your emotional detachment has upended the equation. It's changed the rules of the game, and for the first time, they're not the ones setting the terms. You'll notice it in the subtle ways. The way they probe for a reaction. The way they test your boundaries or try to evoke guilt, nostalgia, or fear. But when you don't respond, not with hostility, not with pleading, not with hope, they're left with nothing to manipulate. And that for them is terrifying, because it means their control isn't just slipping, it's gone. What we're really talking about here is individuation, the psychological process of becoming whole, autonomous, and integrated. When you emotionally detach, you're no longer orbiting around someone else's dysfunction. You're anchored in your own values. You've taken back the authority to define what's real, what matters, and what's acceptable. And in doing so, you've denied them the one thing they crave most, significance at your expense. It's a profound shift. One that doesn't require confrontation or revenge, just consistency, quiet, steady self-possession. And the narcissist doesn't know what to do with that because they're used to extremes, love or hate, worship or abandonment. But indifference, that's not a language they speak. That's the one thing they can't spin, can't twist, can't fight. And this is where the transformation truly begins. Not in them, but in you. You're no longer dancing to their rhythm, you're creating your own. And that's when they realize, often too late, that the version of you they tried to control no longer exists. You've evolved, you've ascended, you've rendered their tactics obsolete. So when your emotional detachment becomes immovable, when it's no longer an act but a reflection of your actual state, they understand, perhaps for the first time, that the power dynamic has ended. Not because you defeated them in some grand confrontation, but because you no longer needed to. You transcended it, you stepped out of the drama. And in doing so, you won. There's something existentially threatening to a narcissist about your independence. Not just the surface level appearance of autonomy, not the illusion of being able to pay your bills or handle your schedule, but the deep internal kind of independence. The type that's rooted in a stable identity, in a mature hierarchy of values, in an integrated understanding of who you are and what you stand for. That kind of independence doesn't just irritate the narcissist, it exposes them. And more than anything else, narcissists fear exposure. Not of their secrets necessarily, but of their lack, the psychological emptiness they've been avoiding their whole lives. Now, why does this matter? Because narcissists are not self-sustaining creatures. Their sense of self is inflated, brittle, and fundamentally externalized. It requires others, often empathetic, conscientious others, to reflect back a sense of value, status, and identity. Without that reflection, their mask begins to crack. Their carefully curated persona dissolves. And what lies underneath is something they can't bear to confront, a deep well of shame, inferiority, and confusion. When you grow independent, not just functionally, but emotionally and psychologically, you become a mirror that doesn't reflect them. You no longer validate their distorted narrative. You no longer react in predictable ways, and in that moment, your presence becomes intolerable. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've stopped serving their psychological defense. Think of it this way. Most people with narcissistic traits construct a false self to survive. That false self is grandiose, impressive, in control, but it's hollow. It doesn't develop through honest engagement with reality. It's a facade built to keep the real self hidden. And the real self, the one that's terrified, the one that feels chronically unworthy, the one that was likely neglected or shamed early in life, that self remains locked away. Now, when someone dependent on external validation encounters someone who's no longer willing to play that game, someone who doesn't fawn, doesn't chase, doesn't need them to feel complete, that person becomes a threat. Not a threat in the violent or aggressive sense, but in a far more destabilizing way. You represent something they've disowned. You reflect a kind of wholeness they don't know how to emulate. And that confrontation with what they lack, that's what begins to unravel them. This is where your independence becomes more than just a personal victory. It becomes a psychological revelation for the narcissist. And it's not one they want. Because to admit you've become self-sufficient, emotionally balanced, clear-headed, unmoved by their chaos, is to admit that their control was never as complete as they believed. And more deeply, it's to admit that something within them is missing. Now, you might be tempted to think that this realization would lead them to change, to seek help, to grow, to become better. And sometimes, very rarely, that's the case. But more often, it leads to escalation or collapse. Because the narcissist cannot easily dismantle the very identity that's protected them from their own inner void. Instead, they double down, or they disengage, or they lash out. Anything but look inward. But that's not your concern anymore, because you've made a shift, a tectonic shift. You no longer exist in their psychological orbit. You've stopped looking to them for approval. You've found meaning in something greater. Maybe in purpose, maybe in faith, maybe in community, maybe simply in the act of truth-telling. But whatever the source, your identity has transcended their reach. And that's when they begin to crumble. Not because you attacked them, not because you exposed them publicly, but because you withdrew the illusion that they were central to your life. You stopped feeding the lie. And that absence, the silence, the peace, the distance, that's what forces them to reckon with the truth they've avoided at all costs. They were never the source of your strength. You were, and you always were. That's a deeply unsettling realization for someone who's built their entire sense of worth on dominance and image. But for you, it's liberating. It's the moment you no longer measure your progress by their reactions. It's the moment you reclaim your time, your energy, your attention. And in that reclaiming, something powerful happens. You begin to build a life that isn't reactive but creative. Not defensive but intentional. Not fragile but resilient. So here's what I'd leave you with. The day you no longer need them to see your worth is the day they begin to see the emptiness in themselves. And that might be the most powerful revelation of all. Not because it hurts them, but because it finally sets you free.